Good evening. My name's Gregor McLennan, Greg, and I'm a trustee of the Stuart Hall Foundation. Established some 5 years ago and inspired by the life and work of Professor Stuart Hall, we're a small charity, but trying to build a big platform, committed to public education and addressing urgent questions of race and inequality in culture and society today. This is the latest in the hashtag Reconstruction work program that we've set up, of which there have been 3 sessions already. And these are online one-to-one conversations, bringing together writers, artists, scholars, and activists to consider how we can build a better society in response to the contemporary conjuncture, not least in the context of the COVID-19 crisis and the Black Lives Matter movements worldwide. The first 3 hashtag Reconstruction work sessions, conversations, which you can catch up on by visiting the Hall Foundation website, explored many issues: Black cultural history, political activism, shifting collective memories, aspects of decolonization. In all of the conversations, and especially in the way in which the different discussants interacted with one another, experiences and issues to do with generation and age came up, especially as cross-cut by situations and consciousness related to class, race, gender, and sex. So the purpose of tonight's discussion is to bring this question of generational experience in politics right to the center of our attention. Now, it's not as though these are issues that haven't been raised before. In 1964, as I well remember, Bob Dylan asked mothers and fathers throughout the land to get out the road if they couldn't lend a hand to the new, in Dylan's hopes, radical younger generation. And Stuart Hall himself researched and thought deeply about youth subcultures, hippies, skinheads, mods, criminalized Black youth, in relation to their parent social milieu and in relation to the disciplining structures of state and society. But that was then, and the times they always are changing. And maybe the question of intergenerational politics today throws up even more extremely difficult and important issues. It's ever so easy to resort to stereotypes and shortcuts. Some say that it's exactly the baby boomer generation that Dylan seemed to want to speak for, who are now landing younger people with unjust debts and precarious lives, which COVID society is exacerbating, they would add. Others, on the contrary, say that it was precisely the old that were callously sacrificed and overlooked as the health crisis kicked in, especially in that early period. Well, maybe our job in these discussions and generally is to get beyond easy stereotypes, to look more carefully and more hopefully, not only at differences between the generations, but similarities across them. To look at how generations are internally differentiated, and to consider what an adequate radical politics of intergenerationality might actually look like, how it could be inclusive and also transformative. Anyway, let me now hand over the conversation to 2 people who are much better able than me to take the issues further, Shiv Malik and Susanna Rustin. Shiv is a technologist, author, broadcaster, and former investigative journalist. He began his career reporting from Afghanistan and Pakistan, subsequently working for The Guardian for 5 years, breaking exclusive front-page stories on everything from UK government social policy to secret ISIS documents. Shiv's a co-founder of the think tank, the Intergenerational Foundation, and the author of 2 super books, The Prescient Jilted Generation, and The Messenger, an intriguing personal tale about a relationship with a terrorist come fantasist. Shiv is majorly concerned in what he does with issues of the new decentralized data economy and with data ownership more generally. Shiv's discussant tonight is social affairs leader writer for The Guardian and fellow Hall trustee, for Hall Foundation trustee, Susanna Rustin. Susanna went to school in a comprehensive school in London and on to university studies at York and Birkbeck. She's been with The Guardian for 18 years or so, covering a range of topics, including education, health, housing, and environment. And she's taken up the roles there of deputy opinion editor, feature writer, and deputy editor of the Saturday Review. Susanna lives in Queen's Park, where she's actually a councillor on London's only parish community council. Stuart Hall was her uncle and an important figure in Susanna's life. I look forward to hearing their discussion. The session's planned to run till about 7:15, and there's the exchange between the speakers should last about 35 minutes, after which there'll be a 20 or 25-minute Q&A session. Please do contribute as we go along in the discussion. Contribute to the Q&As by, if you're in the Zoom room, you can just ask these via the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. So I have pleasure now in thanking in advance our speakers and handing over to Susanna.
Thanks very much, Greg, for that excellent introduction. I'm just holding my microphone here, which is why my hand is in front of my face. And hello, Shiv. So it's 10 years since your book, Jilted Generation, How Britain Has Bankrupted Its Youth, which I should stress was co-written with Ed Hauker, who isn't here today. It's 10 years since it came out, in the immediate, or pretty immediate aftermath of the 2008-2009 banking crisis and the 2010 election, when, of course, Labour lost power. And I just wanted to start by asking why you wrote that book then.
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think both Ed and I were kind of looking around us as we were, both journalists at the time. And so it's kind of, in our blood to kind of look around and see what's going on and see what's changing, see what's different. And I could spot certainly that, me and my generation and the sort of my cohort around me were having a very difficult time of it when it came to, doing the sort of things that our parents had done, right? Living a life course, whether that meant sort of buying a home or settling down or having children. I could see things were getting delayed. Things certainly weren't as easy as they were seemingly for my mother, who even as a sort of a single parent, had been able to, start to sort of afford a home and raise 2 children. And that made, and Ed came into it from a slightly different way, which is actually cultural. He was like, look, why on earth, is there so much sort of pop culture sort of still circulated around kind of the 60s, or centered around the 60s and the 70s? When you kind of open up the Sunday supplements, you see like, more Beatles, old photos, or the Rolling Stones, or, whoever it may be. And actually, we were going to call the book, the working title for it was The Rolling Stones Must Die, which actually probably would have been a better title. And so those 2 things came together, and I said, look, why don't I go look at the numbers and sort of sit in the British Library for a couple of weeks and see what I can dig out. And I think that's where it really started. It was kind of horrified by the fact that actually there was a real truth to the fact, in a sense that our generation was, when it, I started the journey with housing, like, yes, it was just going to be harder. It is harder. And finally, I had at least a kind of a weapon when I was talking to, my parents and their generation, like, actually, yeah, no, it is harder. It's not just my fault, in a sense, that I can't do these other things.
And as Greg mentioned in his introduction, intergenerational conflicts and inequalities, not a completely new idea. Sort of youth culture and sort of rebellions that are associated with youth culture have been a really sort of prominent part of social and cultural life, right through the post-war period. And along with just about every other division in society, sort of intergenerational differences is very much to the fore at the moment, with the emphasis on health and so on in particular. But when the book came out, I know that the reception was quite hostile, or not universally, certainly wasn't universally warm. And I just wondered if you could say something about that and why you think it was. It's obviously 10 years ago now, so it just seems an interesting moment to look back.
Yeah, it was interestingly kind of hostile from actually several different places. There's a guy called David Willett, a former education minister, now Lord Willett, who was in the Conservative government at the time. And he had also written a book that was somewhat similar to this, called The Pinch. And his frame was very much, look, first of all, he wrote about the baby boomers and that generation, and how they had, I think the subtitle was indeed, how they had stolen the kind of next generation's wealth, something along those lines. And so it pitted instantly the frame of intergenerational justice, however you wanted to talk about it, was suddenly like, oh, look, there's these old people and they're like making the lives of the younger people incredibly miserable. And it's older people's fault that they're doing this. Almost like they're kind of morally failing because they're greedy. And when you call it the pinch, it means to thieve something, right, in a sense. So the kind of the moral aspects of that were sort of interwoven into it immediately. So when we wrote our book, which was from the perspective of our generation, so it's like what is actually going on with younger people? What are their life course? What does it look like when it comes to housing or jobs or saving for a pension? And what does the kind of sort of medium-term future look like for us? Then instantly, it was older people who said, oh, look, you're all whining and complaining. So you're kind of a bunch of snowflakes, basically. And I think actually, Claire Fox came up with that term, the snowflake. And it was not long after she met me. So maybe I'm responsible for it in some way. So apologies, universe, for that. And I can remember going on a book tour to Bath, which is famously sort of full of sort of slightly wealthier, older people, and it was just visceral hatred in the audience for me. I think I was with Ed at the time, so for both of us on the stage, and it was kind of, why are you blaming us? Why are you blaming me? Actually, it suddenly became very personal. I've had a hard life too. Don't you understand the sacrifices I've made? And I think that critique was sort of somewhat fair. I don't think any of them had, first of all, read the book, so maybe that comes with the territory. But we were a little tone deaf maybe to that kind of critique of, well, actually, we're not really giving other people's lives and their sacrifices dignity. But we weren't really into that game. We were like, no, we want to talk about us. We don't have to talk about you. And can you not deal with that for some reason? And I think that's also a fair retort. And the second sort of area of hostility, if you want, came very much from the left. Ed is, as I said, more on the right. He situated himself quite on the kind of almost center right, and at one point, politically speaking, and has moved now, I think, to the left. And I can champion myself for maybe helping to convert him, I think, to see the light in some ways. So, but there was a sort of a synergy in a sense, and I think my close friends who I wanted to sort of look at this beforehand, who then later and still are very much sort of, say, Corbyn supporters, for example, they were dismayed at what I was writing, and they sort of said, look, how can you write this kind of thing? It doesn't sit with the class analysis, is ostensibly what they said, and how they sort of critiqued it. You're completely ignoring the factors within generations as far as being far more important as those between generations. And maybe, Susanna, it's worth setting out kind of the stall here, if you want. Shall I do that now?
Sure, yep, go ahead.
Yeah, so, okay, so what do I mean by intergenerational dynamics in this sense? So all divisions are arbitrary. Let's just start with that, right? They're kind of all made up in many senses. You know, we're undergoing a conversation about gender, and we can realize even sex, like how arbitrary to an extent it can be, right? But certainly with class, it's definitely arbitrary. You're just drawing lines in the sand and saying, you know, these people are working class and these people are middle class. And obviously these definitions get more and less important depending on what you're looking at. But certainly with generations, again, you're drawing lines in the sand that probably don't always correspond very well to the real world. However, they're a useful metric for viewing change or for viewing the dynamics in society if it turns out that, you know, the earlier you were born makes, you know, when you were born makes a big difference to your life outcomes, right? Not into what class you're born into, but when you were born. Literally the time into which you were born makes a big difference to your life outcomes. If that's the case, then generations is what you want to use as your lens for analyzing this. So there are kind of several generations. There's the greatest generation, those who were either between the wars or fought in the wars, and they're generally speaking over 75, right? So that's the division now. They were born pre-1945, basically. Then there's the baby boomers, who we've heard much about, and they are currently aged 55 to 75. And they're born, you know, therefore correspondingly 1945 to 65. Then there's the Generation Xers who sit in the middle, and then there's millennials, of which I'm part of that generation, who are kind of born from 1980 to 1995. And the idea behind that terminology of millennials is that they came of age around the millennium, which is actually when I came of age, which is nice. That fits me. So there's these kind of, and then there's Gen Z afterwards. And we kind of always end up going, oh yeah, Gen Z afterwards, but they're teenagers still at the moment kind of thing, or they're just entering their 20s. And so there's still lots to learn about what might happen to them. So that's the kind of panoply of generations.
David Willits there's another one in there. There's the he has a silent generation in between the greatest generation and the boomers. So in his schema, the greatest generation, I guess, would be the very old now, if not, you know, probably not that many of them around anymore. And then the silent generation, who I'm aware of because it's the generation my parents belong to, are the ones that are born including during the war, sort of up until the baby boomers. But anyway,
and look, again, you know, there are no international definitions for any of this, which is crazy because you could actually, like, you know, it's so some people say, oh, millennials it's 1981 to 1994, or it's 2000, and you know, it's the literature on this is, you know, from an academic perspective, it's all over the place, a complete mess, which is a real shame because I think, you know, given that they're somewhat arbitrary, like you could just adjust this and you could have a kind of cohesive conversation over simple terms like this, which also kind of, you know, I think belies the state of this kind of analysis in academia. It is very, very rough and ready, but it still tells you a lot. And I think that's why I was so attracted to it. You know, I mean, I don't know whether you want to ask another question here, or I can something else.
Well, I was just going to say that, I mean, I think we're quite a useful illustration of some of the questions around this terminology and analysis. This set of talks we've described as intergenerational, but in sort of ordinary layman's or laywoman's terms, we aren't from different generations because I'm not old enough to be your mum. We're just about 10 years apart. But we can call ourselves different generations for these purposes because we happen to fall on either side of one of these intergenerational analysis markers, because I'm a Generation X and you're a millennial. I think for us too, the classification works pretty well because I had a free university education, which you won't have done. And also I was able to buy a flat in the 1990s, like almost all my peers, before prices got so high as to make this incredibly difficult. But obviously not everybody in my generation bought a flat, and not everybody in your generation has sort of student debt. So I just wanted to I know you've already talked about how these definitions, have their limits, but is it a rather sort of, a bit of a middle class way of looking at things, in the way that property prices and sort of student debt are such key, do seem to be two of the key terms, the contested.
No, and the reason is this. I mean, look, I think in a sense, are these middle class concerns? Yes, to an extent, right? So getting on the property ladder, I kind of look around me and look at the kind of most qualified and hardest working of my generation, if you want, of like my peers. And, we can go into kind of what my background is. I find it very hard to define myself in my earlier life as middle class. I would fall into the working class background, I think, for sure. But then at the same time, it's so confusing for me to find a definition that I don't. But looking at, for example, I have a friend who's a qualified barrister. She comes from a working class background, but she qualified as a barrister, which is a very expensive thing to do. And her husband has a PhD and is an archaeologist, right? So otherwise, very kind of upper middle class sort of background. And can they afford to raise a family and have a home? Not in London, which was their preferred place. They've kind of moved back into their parental home for a long while. And that was as best as they could afford. Again, other lawyers and doctors who I know, again, it's kind of struggling with this. So yes, at one end, it's kind of a middle class concern. But the other end, if you know that the middle classes are faring badly on that perspective, then you know that the working classes, as in those born to sort of working class parents, might also probably not do very well either. And then you're looking at a whole generation who, from the perspective of just one thing, which is being able to own assets, whether it's housing or just pensions, are doing really badly. So the whole generation's faring badly, especially compared to their parents. And I think one of the most shocking things is this, and you kind of, when you root through all of these aspects of comparing one generation with the one that's gone before, you kind of get to this kind of really rock bottom conclusion, which is, and I did this work for The Guardian in 2016. So when I was writing Jilted, the numbers that we were using were from 2008. So they didn't even include the financial crash. And I was trying to figure out at that point, from a numbers perspective, would our lives be as good as our parents, or worse, or maybe better but just like delayed, right? So we'll eventually get there, but we're living longer. So maybe it all works out in the end, if you want. And when I came back to those numbers, and the numbers in 2008 were not very conclusive in the UK. Then I did an international project for The Guardian, where I went back to the numbers from 2013 onwards. And me and one of the data editors from The Guardian went to Luxembourg, where they house basically the world's repository of economic surveys. This is like great geek stuff. And literally millions and millions of lines of entries going back sort of 30 or 40 years, something like that. And we wanted to, no one had ever done, amazingly, an intergenerational analysis. No one had ever asked the question, well, how is one generation doing compared to the next? Lots and lots of studies on inequality between generations and how the richer got richer or poorer got poorer, etc. But nothing in 40 years on how generations had done compared to one another. When you did that analysis, you found some horrific conclusion, which was that across a number of countries in the West, millennials were going to have a worse life than their parents. They were already living that worse life, and it looked like that was going to extrapolate onwards. And this is obviously pre-pandemic, but post-crash. That leads you to a conclusion, which is, I think, pretty horrific, which is that modernism, that notion that the future will be better than the past, was itself no longer functioning as a thing that you could believe in it, but actually the facts on the ground weren't there. And for 150 years, we've lived an economic truth, right? That decade on decade, bar war, basically, and natural disaster, but even natural disaster hasn't featured, but bar war, decade on decade, since the last 150 years, every generation has lived a better life than the one before it. Just full stop. Not much better, but just better. And sometimes a lot better, but always better. Right, economically speaking. And we've destroyed that in the last 15 years. We've managed to somehow send that into reverse for the first time, which is astounding. And that, for me, is the core of like the outcome of an intergenerational analysis. Like, that shouldn't happen. That is very frightening. And I think it gives rise to these very deep and important and other frightening trends, which are reactionary, which aren't modern, right? They're Trump and Brexit. They're like, we want to go back to the past. Well, but why? Because the past is better. So it's actually a rational position to take.
So some of the problems which you've highlighted, such as the issue around house prices, has been broadly accepted now. But there are some other things that you pointed to 10 years ago and which have increased since then, such as changes in the benefit system, for example, that appear sort of overtly discriminatory, such as lower wages, lower minimum wage for under 21s, and specific rules around housing entitlements for the under 25s and under 35s. I know that, this often, at this point, I feel like the discussion often degenerates a bit into a sort of, the sort of triple lock pension versus youth agnostic. But in terms of sort of focusing on the ways that policies around younger people and the kind of expectations that younger people should be allowed to have in terms of developing their lives, why do you think that that policymaking has developed in this way, as it has?
I mean, the simplistic answer is, and look, it's really disturbing for me that time and time again, it's always young adults. I don't want to call them young people. I stopped doing that, or like youth, because they're not. I'm almost 40. We used to be 40-year-olds used to be the mainstay of any society like 40 years ago, right? They were like the median age people, because most people died when they were 65. That's just how it worked. So 40-year-olds were like middle age. That was middle age. Like middle age crisis happened then. Right. And that therefore were the group of people who you catered for if you're a government, right? You work towards those people, right? Because they're kind of the people with families and the people who are building their lives, right? Now, in a sense, policy has been completely split between younger adults with children and pensioners. And the Tories have found that those pensioners would tend to vote for them. And so policy has very much diverged from the kind of conservative perspective of pitching policies towards them. Gordon Brown famously, right? Maybe the story starts, if you want to where the place to start the story, with, I mean, Susanna, you'll remember this better. Was it like a 7 pence or 10 pence rise in the pension in 2009? Right? Gordon Brown announces the uplift in the state pension will be as 10 pence. And people are horrified, or the media is horrified, the right-wing media. And he rues the day when he kind of, that's his policy outcome, because pensioners stop voting for him, or so the story goes. And you end up in a situation where, even through a vast period of austerity, pensioners, by and large, end up not just getting wealthier or making more money through the period of austerity. They end up at the point where they make more, pensioners after housing costs now make more money on average than people who work. That's just, and people under 45 who work. So they earn more from doing nothing than people who do the work. And that's odd. It's odd. Now you can have, at that point, you can go two ways, right? You can say, oh my God, Shiv, like this is terrible. Why are you beating up on pensioners, right? They're old, they're frail. And I mean, then at 65, I think most baby boomers are the kind of healthiest generation ever. So they're not old and frail, and they would rather bristle at being called old and frail. But they have a whole slew of benefits. Why are you beating up on these people? And also from the kind of left perspective, look, shouldn't we want the state to back everyone in a kind of universal basic income kind of way? So don't take from people, give to you, right? So fight for your own rights, don't, and more income in a sense from the state. Why try and take it away from, why try and take away free travel across London? Fight for the return of free travel for under 17s. Right? Or under 25, I can't remember. No young people now have free travel around London, where all people over 60 do, right? It kind of makes me upset. So don't do that, Shiv, is the kind of pushback. I like to see it this way. Pensioners, and this is the kind of, here's a Marxist bent on this. Who are pensioners from an economic perspective? they're people who derive their income not from labor. So they're not working class anymore. They're just not. They might culturally be working class, but they're not working class anymore. They derive it from capital, right? They derive it from savings, or they derive it from a pension, which is invested in companies that accrue dividends and is returned to them, right? Or they get it from the state, who give them some benefits, which makes up, by the way, a very small proportion of most pensioners' income. They don't all live off the state pension. Which is derived from the state taking it from laborers, right? So it's just another form of, if you want, living off other people's labor. So if you look at it that way, you think, oh God, wow, we've seen the rise of this weird sort of capitalist class, right? Who are defined by age alone, weirdly, right? Why can't I be a pensioner now, right? Oh, it doesn't work like that, right? It's weird. And there's more of them than ever before. So as a class, as a force in society, from a Marxist perspective, they didn't exist before, they do now, and they have very different interests to the working class. That's how I would see it.
It's often pointed out that, for example, voting has begun to sort of segment along generational lines much more than it used to. With sort of Corbyn famously, and sort of 18 to 24s and so on. I mean, I think that subsequently there's been some questions over the extent of the sort of youthquakes that have been described. But nonetheless, that is a phenomenon. I'm just, and I.
Oh,
can you hear me?
Yeah, we lost you. You broke up from Youthquakes.
Okay. So I think there's been a segmentation of voting habits along age lines. And I just wonder to what extent you think that this is the reason for it, really, that the underlying reasons are economic rather than, I think there are cultural reasons as well, aren't there? For example, in attitudes to the European Union, sort of social attitudes. And I guess two different things can coexist and both be true, but I just wonder to what extent you think that the underlying reasons are economic, or perhaps more economic than people realize.
Yeah, so as Owen Jones recently stated, age has now become the one of the biggest, if not the biggest, predictor of voting behavior in this country, and also now, fascinatingly, in the US and in other places. Why? Right? Why is this so? And this is one of the kind of, for me anyway, one of the retorts to kind of the simple sort of classist kind of analysis. If there was a homogenous class, why are young people from the working class voting completely differently from old people from the working class? It doesn't make any sense, right? Why do they just have very different habits? Why do they have different housing setups? And as I've said, why do they have different incomes? Why do they derive their incomes in very different ways? Like, this just all broken down, right? It's not the same as it was before 30, 40 years ago. For me, this is fascinating. So why would, in a sense, older people vote for Brexit, for the Conservatives, and in America, largely, by and large, for Trump? Where young people then diverge rapidly to the kind of other side. Well, I think it's more interesting to look at what young people are doing in that sense, because I think they're voting just almost like the working class would, because they're working class. Very few of them own assets that they can derive income from. So they all work, and that's where they get their money from. So they're working class. That's how that works in my book. And kind of, yes, it's simplistic, I know. But I feel like we need to get back to strip back a lot of other stuff and keep it a kind of economic core. And when you do that, Dan Hines' work on this, on the kind of precariat, is really important here. That, people are sick and tired of 0 hours contracts, a lack of career prospects, interning for free, which I campaigned against, and thankfully is somewhat subsided, but will probably make a horrible return back. I remember also campaigning against at one point, in 2011-12, there was a serious prospect, right? It was happening, that the Conservative government was saying, if you work for your benefits, work for free for your benefits, right? Work in Tesco's. Otherwise, you won't get your benefits, which is crazy. Like, Tesco's were about to, and a whole slew of other corporations in this country, we're going to get free labor in return for benefits. That's nuts. That's like a slave class you've created right there, in a sense, right? Or an indentured class, I should say, of people. So I think, you know, all these things were, have, you know, young adults have woken up, or younger adults have woken up to the fact that their interests lie in people who speak to their lives. It's just pretty obvious in a sense, right? So people like Corbyn or Bernie Sanders do speak to a kind of, resonate with a kind of working class mentality, like, you know, work matters. Let's make work pay. Let's give dignity to people. So when they do work, wherever they work, you know, in a bar, or as a nurse or as a teacher, they can actually build a life, right? Because you're imbuing their lives with dignity. You respect their lives enough that if they work at their job, they can build a life that's kind of consummate with what they believe should be the case. They can raise a family, they can perhaps own a home, or at least rent and not worry about losing that home. And they can even save for old age. These are things that were there in the 1940s or 50s as kind of, you know, aspirations, and now we seem to have lost them for my generation. That's nuts.
I know you just mentioned Marx, and I know you see it as a Marxist argument, but in the book, and maybe that's changed since, but you're very clear that you're not an anti-capitalist. But what you describe is a sort of ending of long-term planning and thinking, both about sort of infrastructure investment and so on, but also just about obligations to future generations, and that sort of short-termism sort of took hold, which you just have described, you know, across a whole range of sort of spheres of life and activity. And I just wondered if you could explain a bit sort of what you think it was that happened I think it's in the 80s really that it starts to happen, but it's never gone back, that made investing in the future seem so much less of a priority, and sort of broke the social contract between the generations, really.
Yeah, so I'm not an anti-capitalist. I'm a pro. I found myself now being able to say what I am for. I am anti-neoliberal capitalism for sure, and that's what we identify in the book as the kind of the main source of the problem for why younger generations have had, in a sense, the same benefits that were given to older generations to help build their lives. Those have been unwound, and how they've been unwound is through, in a sense, neoliberalism. And I find myself saying I am a pro-mutualist or pro-cooperativist. We can come back to that in a second. Let me give you a story about kind of why a neoliberalism mindset kind of unwound makes for short-termism. And there's a couple of ways I can pitch this, but I'll tell you the story. So Norway and Britain both found that in the late 70s they discovered oil. Norway was a very poor country. It was basically, as one person put it to me, it's kind of, you know, we were just sort of living off fishing. And they discovered this oil, and it was a big boon to them, and they had a decision to make, like we did. What do you do with the surplus, right? Money, like, this is great, right? Norway decided, under the stewardship of Gro Brundtland, their first female prime minister, I think at the time, they decided that they wouldn't spend the money. They would save it. They would stick it in a pot, and only spend the capital, only spend the interest from the capital, which means that they had nothing for many, many years. And actually, I met Gro Brundtland recently, and she told me the story behind it. She said it was incredibly difficult to persuade a bunch of fishermen to say, save your money and live basically in poverty for another couple of decades, and don't spend this money, even though there's a ton of money in there compared to what they already had. We, on the other hand, decided under Thatcher to give everyone a tax cut. And so people at one point in time made, had a rosier life. We've got nothing to show for it now, unfortunately. Whereas Norway has the world's biggest investment fund, sovereign wealth fund, and they're still living off the proceeds. They pay for all their pensions through this fund. I've forgotten what the Norwegian is now for the fund, but it is the Status Pensjonsfondet. That I've massacred that if that's Norwegian, but that's what it is. And they're able now to transition to green energy and all sorts of other things through this fund. That's the difference. That's what a kind of neoliberal mindset did. Let me add one other thing, which is to say, when people look at what Thatcher did, they forget about the very first thing that she did, which was literally a month after taking office, she decided unilaterally to abandon all capital controls, right? And kind of people don't really know what that means. It means that you could move money out of the country and it wasn't an arrestable offense anymore. You could effectively, anyone from outside of the UK could come in and buy UK companies, right? We decided that unilaterally almost. No one else, everyone else thought this was a ridiculous idea. And that's what Keynesianism was, that you had all these different levers, which included like rent controls, capital controls, you can take your money out, you can buy companies, all these other things that were vital to running a full Keynesian economy. When we got rid of that, it meant that suddenly, in a sense, individuals and corporations who have shorter term interests were suddenly in the driving seat, right? And that reduced people's propensity to invest into the future. That's a kind of very shorthand way of kind of going over that argument.
And how do you think things look for Generation Z, who obviously were, hardly around 10 years ago, but now teenagers, and obviously quite aware of what's going on around them with the pandemic and so on?
I kind of want to go on the last evidence I had was from 2016, so it's probably completely outdated attitudinal stuff. But it looks like Gen Z, when I kind of look more recently, I'm kind of a generational loyalist, if you want. I don't really care about any other generation. No, that's not true. Gen Z are basically, millennials still have this very rosy idea, at least kind of older millennials, if you want, that the world will be as promised in the 90s, right? You will, in fact, be able to buy that home. You will, in fact, be able to raise that family of a certain age at a certain time, and you will kind of retire early, right? You'll have early retirement at 60, and it'll be fine. Gen Z are under no apprehensions in that regard, that the world will not look like that. And that I think has made them more radical and appreciate more radical solutions, will be more amenable towards them. Incidentally, again, when you look at some of the numbers, it's actually millennials and Gen Z who really don't hold democracy in high regard. So it also means that too, right? That's very worrying, right? If you're a Democrat, you're like, what has democracy done for me? The answer is nothing. It's given me a worse life than my parents, which is not how I expected life to be. So maybe the whole system, including democracy, is wrong. That's always worrying. People try to ignore that because they're like, oh, young people, they must be great and optimistic and our future is there. But that's not always the case, as we know.
Do please, if you have any questions, just click on the Q&A button on the screen and just write them in there. I've got a couple more, but it'd be great to have some from you. Got time for that. And while you do that, I've got a couple more questions. Moving on to a more positive note, I know you think that there are solutions to this plight that you found yourself in, and many others. So do you want to just talk a bit about that and what's the way out of this? How do we create a different sort of settlement?
Yeah, if the problem is inherently short-termism, right? People and societies and institutions sort of lack or an inability to plan for the future, right? Like why fundamentally do houses cost a lot in this country? Well, it's because we haven't built enough, right? And we have a real lack of imagination. We should be, in my view, building more cities, full stop. But then also, why are people's jobs, the standard of kind of, or labor standards being driven down? And it's because, you've had a kind of rush of globalization where, outside companies come in and tear up a company and looking for profits over the next couple of years. And, because they're a VC and they're like, we just have to make, returns on our investment and that's all we care about. So it's sort of that, what we call greed is what economists call short-termism, or kind of a lower time preference, right? That's the sort of technical sort of definition, if you want. And so the solution has to be, well, how do you kind of somehow put the levers of control and power back into bodies that have longer term preferences, right? That think over 10, 15, 100 year horizons and not about the next 3 years or the next 5-year political cycle. And so that search and that quest has been quite long to find something that's sort of viable as a kind of holistic set of ideas, but they're sort of staring everyone in the face, which is wonderful. And in fact, and so I find myself basically attracted to the cooperativist movement and mutualism. Why? It means, so first of all, it's worth knowing, if people don't know, that the Labour Party is not just the Labour Party, it's the Labour and Cooperative Party. There's actually 2 parties in there. And there's about 30, last time I looked, cooperative MPs. So they've got subsumed into the Labour movement, which it shouldn't have been, because they're completely different in many ways. They have synergies, but they are different and have a very different outlook. You've obviously shopped in co-ops before, and you've probably gone to John Lewis or Waitrose at one point, and those are mutuals. They're owned by their employees. And the idea here is that you, against the ravages, if you want, of globalization, right? Against all of this greed, what you do is you take equity and you root it in communities, right? You're like, where's this money going? We don't want it going to Panama anymore, right? We want it rooted in our communities. And, you know, and Jeremy Corbyn and John MacDonald, I should say, really, were actually champions of these ideas. And they wanted to see a far more cooperativist society. You know, Britain has, this is a bit of a side note, but Britain has given the world some seriously amazing economic ideas, right? Adam Smith and capitalism, Marx and Marxism, the cooperative movement, which is very much unknown, and also socialism in many, well, the Fabian movement, and Keynesianism, right? There's like a bunch of ideas that Britain has generated. So I think like the one that's least tried and tested is the cooperative movement. And that's where I find myself leading to. It turns out also that, digitally speaking, there's a lot you can do with open source software that becomes cooperative. You know, when we're looking at like the biggest companies in the world, you can turn those all into cooperative platforms. And that's really exciting. That's literally what I'm working on in my day job.
Great. We've got some questions coming through now. I'm just going to ask 1 or maybe 2 more, and then we'll go to them. But, do pop in any more that come to mind. This has obviously been a year of a great sort of struggle, activism for racial justice in the US, but also in the UK and globally. You mentioned gender, and I just wondered how you think that sort of intergenerational analysis intersects with these other inequalities, obviously, particularly at the moment. And I just also wondered whether sort of the sense of inequality being so sharp in the right now makes it quite hard to think about the intergenerational dimension, which is by definition sort of long term. And I think people are understandably preoccupied about sort of sharing things out more fairly right now. And it just feels a bit sort of head scramble to try and do that whilst also thinking about how things will be in 20 years.
Yeah, I guess for me, like, you know, the 2 biggest issues on the table are climate change and the economy, right? And this issue that I spoke about earlier about modernism, right? If the future can't be better than the past, then we might as, like, we're living in a literally retrogressive society, and we might as well pack in everything we do, right? What's the point in racing? Unfortunately, like, is it physics that dictates that we go chronologically in one direction, right? We can't escape that. And to be forced into a future that's worse than the present is an awful, awful scenario, right? It's viscerally, like, I mean, it just churns my stomach, as I'm sure it does everyone else, to know that the more you live, the worse it gets, just by the virtue of living. That's terrible. So that for me ranks, and it turns out both those problems are the same problem, right? It's just a lack of long-term thinking and an inability to grasp that this is the case, right? And what's before us. So everything else for me is subsidiary to that. Why? And it actually aggravates those problems even more, because if you're trying to fight over a pie that's shrinking, then that is a fight that becomes far more vicious than one in which it's growing. And one in which if you're trying to work out how to, you can fight over what you have, literally. Like, just imagine like the kind of housing supply is finite. I don't know, I keep going back to housing, but let's just stick with that, right? Fine, and we can all divvy up the spoils of that and fight over it, right? And realize that there's going to be some serious losers and winners, or we just like have more of it, right? That's generally speaking what we've been able to do. We can do this, and turns out, in really like actually carbon negative ways by building there are really interesting techniques now that make things carbon negative. So we can do this in an environmentally not just sustainable or beneficial way in some senses. So great, let's do that. Let's do the second rather than like fight over a finite pie. But, we've all, I think, become very defensive. And I think that's also, again, in a sort of almost sort of simplistic Marxist way, like the economics is defining the culture here, right? The culture has become this way because the economics is so bad. Is that answer the question in some senses?
Yeah. Okay, let's go to these questions that people have been sending in. So I've got one from David Edgar, which is, I'll just read it out. So the irony, the morning after the Brexit vote, a young Leaver asking a Brexit voting granny, what have you done? Sorry, I'm just slightly struggling to swallow this.
There's a question above, actually. If you want to read that one, I can read out the other one. So how can young adults have greater influence and affect change?
Change, yeah, great. Why don't you take that one?
So I think, as I said before, I think in a sense, like the older strategies of, I've been on innumerable marches, and I have in fact, the whole kind of intergenerational thing at one point also was sparked by environmental protests that I was part of in 2009. But, I've been, my first major protest was in 2000 when I was in Oxford Circus and was part of the first kettle implemented by the Metropolitan Police, literally in Oxford Circus. So it was just like a circle and just kept us there for like 9 hours. So, people say, oh, get out and either vote or protest or make your voices heard. I've done that for a long time. And I think what we need is an actual plan. And an actual plan means changing economics, right? And that everyone knows that the system stinks. I think everyone is pretty au fait with like, yeah, it stinks, what we have at the moment. But nothing else is like particularly viable on the table except for the kind of Corbynistic ideas, which cause antagonism from older adults. They don't like that. They don't like state control, if you want, over more of their lives as they would see it. And I know that lots of Europe obviously runs in that way, but it seems not to, can get into arguments in that. But I prefer a much less antagonistic way of going about things and opting and plumping for building out the ideas around mutualism and cooperativism, because I think it's there, and I think there's a lot that younger adults can really do. Like, again, it can solve both housing and jobs and actually pensions. All these things can be solved by mutuals. There's more in the world than just those things. But all of those things can be solved by kind of cooperative and mutualist ideas. And I think it's like the onus is on us, and by us, I mean the people in this room who are more inclined to do this kind of thing, is to understand those ideas more. And I should write my book because I'm halfway through it and I should finish that off.
Do you think that kind of economic localism, if you want to call it that, can happen without a sort of political devolution as well?
I think it is. I mean, it should be possible because, it doesn't depend on government to survive. It doesn't depend. It helps if government's supportive of it, but you don't need anyone else to do this sort of stuff, right? And and it appeals in theory to millennials' sense of, actually, because it turns out, despite what the people listening to this talk might think, millennials don't trust the state. They don't like centralized power of any kind, particularly. So, because it's not really done much for them. That's if you look at all millennials, not in our like little bubble over here, if you want.
Yeah. Right, I've got my head around this other question now. It's just the line breaks falling in a slightly awkward way on the screen. So in the 2017 and 2019, the older you were, the more likely you were to vote Conservative. I think in 2017, the crossover point was age 47. 2019, it was still a bit older. And the COVID policy battle has essentially been between sort of neo-Darwinist herd immunity, sort of survive if you can, and intergenerational solidarity, which is our questionnaire describes as put your life on hold to save Granny. And the latter has won so far. So one way of looking at the COVID crisis is another kick in the teeth by the old against the young. But on the other hand, the question is, the left can't abandon intergenerational solidarity, can it?
Doesn't need to. I don't know why we have to always pitch these things in adversarial ways. I think it's actually because people see things through a caste lens, and that's often been pitched in adversarial ways. No one suggests that the working class and the upper class should unite and have solidarity, right? If they do, I haven't really heard that. And so I think that naturally flows into, well, if these lenses are always adversarial, then shouldn't intergenerational analysis also mean old versus young? It doesn't follow. It doesn't follow. It doesn't have to follow. It turns out that we are divided up that way. We have been divided up that way. If you look at where the money's gone to, it hasn't gone to younger adults. It hasn't gone to people with families. Universal childcare benefit is no longer universal. That was the first time in 50 years that happened. Why? Because, young people don't have any political power on one end, right? And there is this new class of people called pensioners who didn't exist before, who need catering for. So we don't need to abandon solidarity, no, because no one's asking that it is abandoned. The problem is that if we don't worry about the future will stop delivering for us. So with that, something has to give, right? Something has to give. And it doesn't mean taking away from people. It means that we have to give it's usually, actually, these are problems of the mind in many senses. Why can't we build 10 new cities, right? Why can't we build 10 new cities that are based on community land trust principles? There's literally nothing stopping us except for our minds, right? And a bunch of people going, not in my backyard. And those people tend to be the people who are already there, who are moneyed, and go, no, thank you, right? In fact, you can just take a lot of greenfield sites and start there, like we used to do. That's how we used to do things. Milton Keynes didn't come from being squeezed into a bunch of other cities, right? We should be expansive about how we think about the future. We should be inventive, and instead of doing what we're doing now, which is to go, oh, please, sir, and begging and scraping for kind of, permission to exist in between spaces that already are owned and controlled.
But do you think there is an appetite for policy making of that sort? I mean, I know there was some enthusiasm around sort of mutualism by Corbyn and McDonnell. And I guess the question is what happens after COVID. Obviously, you wrote your book after the 2008-2009 crash, and obviously this, we're now in another sort of dreadful period of job losses and really serious hardship. So the question is, after that, do you think there is an appetite to invest in such a way as to...
I mean, this is the thing, like, do you want to, this is the insanity of it, right? And this is where the solidarity should run. It should run from old to young, right? If there's ever a time for it to run the other way, right, given what we've gone through with COVID, it should be now. But hopefully it will. But I don't know. I think it requires politicians to actually ask people to step up. So this is what we should do. Should we be spending resources on allowing 60-year-olds, but whoever they are, however rich they are, just to use London transport, right, for free, when no one else can? Or should we say, well, let's think about where else we could put that money? Like, let's build whole new cities so people can actually, when they work, they can spend their money on their lives and saving for the future and building up, rather than paying private landlords, right? Like, do we want them to live in penury, or can't we think outside of the box on this, right? Now, that's assuming that you can't borrow like we've just done, right? Because like even, a minuscule, like, I don't know, 10% of what we borrowed would absolutely pay for all these things. Given that it's our debt to pay, I don't see why anyone else should have a say over it who's older. Like, oh, and they don't. And actually, older people go, look, it's your debt, right? And like, so yeah, it's our future. And this is maybe the fulcrum point of power, and which exists in the minds of the 60 million people that live on these isles, which is, I think there's been a shift, right? Older people have realized they're not in control anymore. And they can't just force what they think is right for the country. And I think younger people have realized we made this huge sacrifice. And rather like after the war, when soldiers came back and went, where's our country, right? We did all that fighting. So what are we going to get for this? And we completely changed the way we did things. I think that's the moment now when young adults have an absolute claim. No longer, don't you dare call us snowflakes, right? Don't you dare call us pampered, avocado, eating, useless, vagabond hipsters. We're the people who sacrifice to make this country, to keep millions of people alive. And we're going to keep paying off this debt for the rest of our lives. It's our country now. And this is what we're going to do with it. That's what we should be thinking. That's how we should be thinking. Sorry, I got impassioned there. That's
all right. I've got a couple more questions. One of them's billed as not really a question, but a comment, but I'll just throw it out there. And if you want to comment, then do, and otherwise I'll go on to the next one. So Thatcher spent a lot of the oil money that you referred to, the North Sea oil money, on unemployment benefit, as well as tax cuts, because she obviously deindustrialized the North and created unemployment on a scale that it hadn't existed before. Do you want to, I guess that's an observation really about the...
Yeah, I mean, look, this is the thing, money's fungible. So if you want to follow the accounts, then you could say, oh, well, maybe the oil money was spent on that, but then what about the other revenues and the bonuses and revenues from, say, look at council housing and be giving out a 50% discount. Why don't we have council housing now? Well, because we sold it to people who took it into private hands at a 50% discount. Can we do that again? No, because we didn't save the money to like build more. We decided to do what with it? Well, give it people a tax break, right? If you look at the tax numbers, they fall rapidly. So something happened, something funded that. And it wasn't actually just drawing down on more debt. So yes, the money's fungible, so you can't track the numbers back per se, but that's, one way of looking at it. Yes.
And then another question, this one's from Maria Amadou. Sorry if I've read out your question and forgotten to say your name, by the way, but anyway, this one is, Maria is wondering, as we're talking about the issue of sort of degrees of comfort and the haves and have-nots, and people who have what they need and are comfortable wanting to protect their status and what they have acquired. How do you imagine a cooperative model would affect this attitude across class and generations?
This is where I kind of like the cooperative model, because it tends to, weirdly, it's actually very conservative, right? Once you're in a cooperative, you don't want to expand out those benefits. So there's actually a major problem with cooperatives or mutuals, right? You tend not to want to invite people in to enjoy the things that you've built over a long period of time. But if there's enough of them and everyone's in one of a sorts, whether it's with their home or their work or their pension savings or their insurance fund, right? All these things can and are mutuals or cooperatives, then great, and that kind of balances it out. For those who already have vested power or equity, or as Maria sort of outlines, then yeah, I think these are unthreatening, right? They kind of sit aside rather than sit upon or try to draw out, right? So it's not about what the cooperative model is like, it doesn't say this, let's just tax the rich, or let's just tax middle classes, which is often what middle classes be, older people, right? Or let's just take, let's just push you out or squeeze things in where you already live. Because we know, people really dislike change, especially when they get older. That's like a attitudinal thing that seems to remain true. So it's a psychological thing, if you want, sorry. It's very non-threatening, I think, right? In that sense, whilst also expanding and being creative and causing economic growth. So that seems like always like a good solution. Why do you need to fight with people when you can just move to the left and move to the side if you want, and do what you're going to do anyway?
So we've got a quote from Thomas Piketty. Ludo Hunter says, how does inheritance fit into your view of intergenerational dynamics? And the quote is, which I guess are being asked to respond to, is when the rate of return on capital significantly exceeds the growth rate of the economy, as it did through much of history until the 19th century, and is likely to be the case again in the 21st century, then it logically follows that inherited wealth grows faster than output and income. Under such conditions, it is almost inevitable that inherited wealth will dominate wealth amassed from a lifetime's labor by a wide margin, and the concentration of capital will attain extremely high levels. So that's just a summary of his argument, isn't it, about the sort of wealth versus income and the kind of the re-rise of wealth again.
I mean, look, globalization supercharged this. That's the real thing, right? In a sense, because imagine if you could just, like we did, ring fence capital. Capital was sort of ring fenced anyway to a certain extent at certain periods in time because technology limited it, transport limited it, all these other things, right? And there's this first period of globalization, which is the late Victorian era, and Keynes writes about it beautifully, just beautifully, in his book which was published in 1919, just in the Treaty of Versailles. There's this paragraph just at the beginning where he says there was this amazing period just before the war where you could just sit in your bed and buy stocks in Shanghai and order things from all around the world, and they just arrive to you, and you're like, that sounds like now, right? Like with Amazon or stock exchange. And he's talking about it, obviously writing about it in 1919. He said all of that came to an end, and that was the end of the first era of globalization. So, these periods have existed before, and globalization always supercharges the ability for the wealthiest to keep getting even wealthier, right? A la Jeff Bezos, right? Amazon, under previous rules, would never allow to operate in this country, right? Because you're like, no, you're a foreign company, you're foreign capital, you cannot come in and compete with us. And so now I think if you don't really understand that globalization trend, then I think, if you're looking at this from the family basis, you're kind of very limited. You're like, oh yes, generation, wealth will pass down through the generations. Well, yeah, that doesn't really explain Jeff Bezos though, right? And how, that wealth has been super concentrated in a very small amount of global elite.
And one more. I guess in response to you talking about how things are getting worse and the sort of modernist idea of progress has gone into reverse, the question is, why shouldn't well-being go on increasing, even though we can't consume more materials and things, with energy from the sun and wind, and people work instead of manufacture, software and education like this seminar, open access to intellectual capital and more democratic education? Big changes, but is it possible?
Yeah, that's a really beautiful question, because it would strike one as to be the case, right? And look, GDP, the people who do GDP, they aren't stupid. They have figured out that there's these other things that we do that aren't necessarily accounted for, and maybe we should account for them. So it's, and is it possible in a sense to keep GDP the same and for well-being to go up? Yeah, it is theoretically possible, but it's not necessarily happening. But then you get down into stuff like this, which is, look, if I want to raise a family, if I want to live in a house where I'm not constantly thrown out by my landlord, if I want to, as I said, save for a pension, if I want dignity at work, right? Zoom isn't giving this to me. I hate to break it to you. It's really not. It's making it worse. I don't even get to go to an office now, right? In a sense. And, I think these things are important. What is important? Ask yourself that, what's the thing that you want to do? Be more French about it, right? Don't, I think also, that's a side point, I won't go into it, but, what is the, you go to work, but you go to then come back and live. So what's the thing that you want to do with your lives? Well, most people, it turns out, really do want to do a very expensive thing, which is to raise a family, right? I mean, maybe I'm being very heteronormative here in a sense, and I put my hand up to that, but people do want to do a really old-fashioned thing, which is, I think, to have children, or to be in a place where they're more than just themselves, over a long period of time. And it turns out to require other things. And if you want to do that, the society that we live in now in Britain really actively works against you doing that. So Zoom doesn't, as I said, Zoom doesn't give that to you. I'm sorry. Or your iPhone. iPhone makes it worse.
Well, I have to come in at this point as the chair. Susanna, for burning questions on the chat line, on the Q&A.
No, we've dealt with them. We've gone through them.
All right. Well, that very conveniently brings us towards 7:15, when we said we would shut the session. Well, personally, I found that a kind of fizzing cocktail of very different styles of ingredients, a kind of expose and denunciation, really, of this composite figure, too simple in my view, called the pensioner. But on the other hand, some really good ideas about investment funds and mutualism that certainly takes us past what Shiv mentioned before was a kind of politics of antagonism. So I think there's just loads to think about there and loads to debate further, but we've certainly had a good slab of interaction and very, very important questions raised. So Shiv, thanks very much indeed, and Susanna for your part in pushing him along. Can
I also say thank you to both of you, to the Stuart Hall Foundation for having me along. I know that me and Susanna have actually been talking about this topic for actually a few years almost. So thank you, Susanna, for kind of making this sort of happen. I really appreciate it. It's a real honor.
Thank you.
Well, if others listening in and watching in have enjoyed tonight's session, along with the others in this Reconstruction work series, please do sign up to our mailing list and participate in our social media vehicles so that you keep informed and participate in the Stuart Hall Foundation program. We want to find new ways of thinking and acting. We do it through our talks and events, and we've got a growing network of Stuart Hall Foundation scholars, activists, and artists in residence. And if you value our work, you can help greatly by making a donation, whether large or small, to the costs of our ongoing work. All the details are to be found on the ever-improving Hall Foundation website. So please do visit us soon there. Please do join in our other events, and we hope to see you again soon. Good night.